Rain hammered the carriage roof as Eleanor Whitmore gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles pale in the dim light. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm, and the horses lurched forward with a violent jolt that threw her sideways. Somewhere ahead, through the sheets of water streaking the window, she saw torches moving fast across the dark lawn of Ashford Manor. Something was wrong, very wrong. The carriage had barely stopped when a footman wrenched the door open, his face pale, his coat soaked through. "Miss Whitmore, you must come quickly, it's Master Henry. He's gone missing near the lake." Eleanor did not wait for her trunk. She lifted her skirts and ran through the mud, following the bobbing lanterns toward the water's edge, her heart pounding harder with every step. She had not even met the family yet. She had not seen the manor in daylight, and already a child's life seemed to hang in the balance. At the edge of the lake, a tall figure stood soaked to the bone, shouting orders to the servants who scrambled along the shoreline. He turned as Eleanor approached, and even in the chaos she felt the weight of his stare. Sharp eyes, a hard jaw set with fury and fear in equal measure. This, she realized, could only be Duke Julian Ashford. "Who let a stranger near my land tonight?" he snapped, not truly a question, more an accusation flung into the storm. "I am the new governess," Eleanor said, raising her voice over the wind. "I can help. Tell me where he was last seen." For a moment, the Duke looked as though he might order her away. Instead, something in her steady voice made him pause. He pointed toward a cluster of willow trees near the far bank. "He was chasing his sister's kitten. One of the maids saw him run that way before the storm broke." Eleanor did not wait for permission. She ran along the slippery bank, calling the boy's name, her lantern swinging wildly in her hand. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the willows for just a moment, long enough for her to see a small shape huddled beneath the drooping branches, shivering, clutching a soaked kitten to his chest. "Henry," she called, sliding down the muddy slope to reach him. The boy looked up, startled, his lips trembling from the cold. "I couldn't leave her. She was scared." "You're safe now," Eleanor said gently, wrapping her shawl around him despite the freezing rain soaking her own dress. "Let's get you home." By the time she carried him back up the bank, the Duke was already running toward them, his fear transforming into something close to relief as he scooped the boy into his arms. For a brief moment, his gaze met Eleanor's over his nephew's soaked hair, and something unreadable passed between them, gratitude tangled with something deeper he did not yet have a name for. That night, after the household settled and Henry was tucked safely into bed with a hot cup of milk, Eleanor was finally shown to her small room in the servants' wing. She sat by the window, still trembling from the cold, and wondered what kind of household she had just entered. She had expected quiet lessons and polite formality. Instead, her very first hour at Ashford Manor had been a race against the dark. She did not know yet that this night would be only the beginning. The following morning, sunlight spilled gently across the manor's long hallways, but the air still felt tense, as though the storm had left its mark on more than just the gardens. Eleanor rose early, dressed simply, and made her way toward the nursery, uncertain of what kind of reception awaited her after the chaos of the previous night. She found Duke Julian waiting outside the nursery door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You acted quickly last night," he said, without preamble. "Most new arrivals would have hesitated." "There was no time to hesitate," Eleanor replied simply. "A child was in danger." He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to understand something that did not quite fit his expectations. "The last governess lasted 2 weeks before she fled this house, claiming the children were unmanageable and the household too somber. I do not expect you to last much longer." There was no cruelty in his tone, only a weary honesty that surprised her. Eleanor lifted her chin. "I don't frighten easily, Your Grace." Something flickered behind his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest trace of respect. He said nothing more before turning and walking away, his boots echoing down the corridor. Inside the nursery, Alina met Henry properly for the first time in daylight, along with his younger sister, Grace, a quiet girl with watchful eyes who studied Alina as though deciding whether she could be trusted. The kitten from the night before sat curled in a basket by the fireplace, already named Willow after the trees where she had been found. "Are you going to leave like the others?" Grace asked bluntly, without looking up from her drawing. Alina knelt beside her. "I don't plan on it." Grace considered this for a moment, then slid her drawing across the table, a simple sketch of the lake, the willow trees, and two figures standing beneath them. "Then you should know the truth about this house. Everyone is sad here. Uncle Julian used to laugh before Aunt Isabel died. Now he barely speaks unless something is wrong." The words settled heavily in Alina's chest. She had heard whispers of the late Duchess before arriving, but hearing it from a child made the loss feel painfully real. Over the following days, Alina settled into a careful rhythm. Mornings were spent on lessons, reading, arithmetic, and gentle discipline that neither frightened nor indulged the children. Afternoons often found her walking the gardens with Henry and Grace, encouraging their curiosity about the world beyond the manor's tall iron gates. Duke Julian remained a distant, watchful presence. He rarely joined them, yet Alina often noticed him standing at the study window, observing the children's laughter drifting up from the garden below. Sometimes she caught him watching her as well, though he always looked away quickly when their eyes met, as though caught doing something he should not. One afternoon, while organizing books in the manor's grand library, Alina discovered the Duke seated in a shadowed corner, a glass of untouched brandy beside him, staring blankly at an open book he did not appear to be reading. "Forgive me," she said, moving to leave. "I did not know anyone was here." "Stay," he said quietly, surprising her. "I would welcome the company if only for a moment." Alina hesitated, then took a seat across from him, keeping a respectful distance. For a long while neither spoke. Finally, the Duke broke the silence. "Do you find this house cold, Miss Whitmore?" The question caught her off guard. "I find it quiet," she admitted carefully, "but not unkind." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Quiet is a kinder word than the one most would choose." He turned the book over in his hands without reading it. "My wife filled these halls with music and conversation. Since she passed, I fear I have let the silence take her place." Alina did not know what to say, so she said nothing, allowing the weight of his words to settle naturally rather than rushing to comfort him. It was, she realized later, exactly what he needed. Not sympathy, but simple presence. "The children are fortunate to have someone who does not flinch from difficult things," he said eventually, closing the book. "Most who come here treat sorrow as something to avoid discussing, as though silence might make it disappear." "Sorrow does not disappear by ignoring it," Alina said softly. "It only grows heavier." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Not merely as a governess hired to manage his niece and nephew, but as a person whose quiet strength unsettled the careful distance he had built around himself. "You speak with unusual wisdom for someone your age," he said. "I have learned it does no good to pretend," Alina replied. "Life has a way of demanding honesty eventually, whether we are ready or not." The conversation ended there, interrupted by a servant announcing supper, but something had shifted between them, subtle yet undeniable. Over the following weeks, small moments accumulated quietly, unnoticed by others but deeply felt by both of them. A shared joke during the children's lessons, a brief exchange of glances across the dinner table. A morning when Julian joined the children in the garden for the first time in over a year, laughing genuinely at Henry's clumsy attempt to teach the kitten to fetch. Alina told herself these moments meant nothing beyond simple kindness, yet she found herself anticipating them more than she cared to admit, and though neither spoke of it directly, the household itself seemed to notice. The staff exchanged knowing glances whenever the Duke lingered near the nursery longer than necessary, or when Aliner's laughter could be heard echoing faintly down hallways that had known only silence for far too long. Neither of them yet understood how quickly quiet moments could shift into something far more dangerous, something that threatened not only their carefully guarded hearts, but the fragile peace of the entire household. That danger was closer than either of them realized. A sharp knock rattled Aliner's door before dawn, pulling her from sleep with a jolt. She opened it to find Alice, one of the younger maids, pale and breathless. "Miss Whitmore, you must come down at once. The Dowager Duchess has arrived, unannounced, and she is already asking questions about you." Aliner's stomach tightened. She dressed quickly, smoothing her hair with trembling hands, and hurried down the grand staircase where raised voices already echoed from the drawing room. She paused just outside the door, close enough to hear the sharp, commanding tone of an older woman. A governess who runs into storms after dark, who dines with the family, who walks the gardens with you as though she were a guest rather than staff. Julian, do you understand how this looks to society? "She saved Henry's life and Augusta," came Julian's steady reply. "I will not apologize for showing gratitude." "Gratitude is one thing. This," the Dowager's voice sharpened, "is something else entirely, and you know it." Aliner stepped back from the door, her heart racing, unsure whether to enter or retreat. Before she could decide, the door opened, and she found herself face to face with the Dowager Duchess Augusta, a tall woman with silver hair pulled into a severe knot and eyes that missed nothing. "So this is her," Augusta said coolly, studying Aliner from head to toe as though inspecting a horse at market. "Younger than I expected, and far too comfortable in a household above her station, from what I hear." "Your Grace," Aliner said, dipping into a careful curtsy, keeping her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered in her ears. "I am only here to serve the children." "See that it remains only that," Augusta replied, sweeping past her without another glance. Julian appeared in the doorway moments later, his jaw tight with restrained frustration. "I apologize for my aunt. She has strong opinions about how this household should be run." "She is not wrong to be cautious," Aliner said quietly. "A governess who draws attention risks more than her own reputation." "You did nothing wrong," Julian said firmly. "I will not have you treated as though you did." But Aliner could not shake the unease settling in her chest. She had seen the calculating look in the Dowager's eyes, the kind of look that belonged to someone already planning her next move. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the manor shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Servants who once greeted Aliner warmly now offered only cautious nods, careful not to be seen favoring her. Whispers followed her through the hallways, quiet enough to remain deniable, yet loud enough for her to catch fragments. Words like unsuitable and forward drifted past her more than once, and though she told herself to ignore them, each one landed like a small stone against her resolve. Grace noticed the change first. "Why is everyone acting strange?" she asked one afternoon, tugging at Aliner's sleeve during their walk through the garden. "Alice won't even look at me when I ask about you." "Sometimes adults worry over things that don't matter," Aliner said gently, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. That evening, dark clouds gathered swiftly over Ashford Manor, promising another storm. Aliner had gone to fetch Henry's favorite book from the garden pavilion, where he had left it during their afternoon lessons. She had barely stepped inside when the sky opened, rain pouring down in relentless sheets, trapping her beneath the pavilion's narrow roof. Moments later, hurried footsteps approached, and Julian appeared, equally soaked, having come searching for her when he noticed she had not returned. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather," he said, breathless, shaking rain from his coat. "Neither should you," Aliner replied, unable to stop the small smile tugging at her lips despite the tension of recent days. They stood close together beneath the narrow shelter, rain crashing loudly around them, isolating the pavilion from the rest of the world. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence charged with something neither dared name. "Eleanor," Julian said finally, his voice low, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Her heart pounded at the unfamiliar use of her first name. "Yes." "Do you feel it too? This, whatever this is, growing between us?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and undeniable. Eleanor's mind raced through every reason she should deny it, every warning her position demanded she heed. Yet standing so close to him, rain soaking through her dress, she found she could not bring herself to lie. "I feel it," she admitted softly. "But feeling it changes nothing, Julian. I am a governess. You are a duke. Society will never allow it." "Society," he repeated almost bitterly. "Must everything bend to society's rules?" "For people like me, yes," Eleanor said, though the words tasted like ash. "One misstep, one rumor taken too seriously, and I lose everything, my position, my reputation, my ability to earn a living anywhere respectable again. You would lose far less." Julian's expression darkened, not with anger toward her, but with frustration at a truth he could not argue against. Before either could say more, a flash of lightning illuminated the pavilion, and in that brief light, Eleanor caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the garden, watching them beneath an umbrella. By the time the darkness returned, the figure was gone. Her stomach dropped. "Someone saw us." Julian turned sharply, scanning the darkened garden but found no one. It could have been a servant checking the grounds. "Or it could have been someone reporting back to your aunt," Eleanor said, panic creeping into her voice. "Julian, if this reaches her, if it reaches anyone, I will be dismissed without reference. I will have nowhere to go." "I would not allow that," he said firmly, stepping closer, his hand hovering near hers though he did not take it. "You may not have a choice," Eleanor whispered. "Please, we cannot risk being seen like this again." The rain finally eased enough for them to hurry back toward the manor separately, taking different paths to avoid suspicion. But the damage, if any had been done, was already set in motion. That night, Eleanor lay awake, replaying the flash of lightning and the shadowed figure at the garden's edge, wondering whose eyes had witnessed a moment she had tried so desperately to keep hidden. Her fears proved justified sooner than she expected. 2 mornings later, she was summoned to the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room, a summons that made her stomach twist with dread the moment the message arrived. Augusta sat rigidly by the window, a folded letter resting on the table beside her. She did not invite Eleanor to sit. "I understand you were seen in the garden pavilion 2 nights ago," Augusta said, her voice cold and measured. "Alone with my nephew during a storm." Eleanor's throat tightened. "We were both caught in the rain, Your Grace. Nothing improper occurred." "Whether something improper occurred matters far less than what people believe occurred," Augusta replied sharply. "Reputation is not built on truth, Miss Whitmore. It is built on perception. And right now, perception suggests my nephew is entangling himself with a governess in a manner that could ruin this family's standing." "I never intended." "Intentions matter little once whispers begin," Augusta interrupted. "I have already arranged a formal match for Julian, one that will secure this family's future and silence any damaging rumors before they spread further. Lady Cordelia Ashworth will be announced as his intended within the fortnight." The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow, though she forced herself to remain composed. "That is the Duke's decision to make, Your Grace, not mine." "Precisely," Augusta said, rising from her seat, her eyes narrowing. "Which is why you would be wise to remove yourself from the situation entirely, before you find yourself blamed for scandal that was never truly yours to carry. I suggest you consider your position very carefully, Miss Whitmore, for your own sake and for the children's." Eleanor left the sitting room shaken, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had just heard. A formal betrothal, arranged swiftly and deliberately, seemed designed specifically to end whatever fragile connection had begun growing between her and Julian. And though no one had explicitly threatened her position, the warning embedded in Augusta's words was unmistakable. She found Julian later that afternoon in his study, and the moment he saw her expression, he set down his papers immediately. "What happened?" "Your aunt knows about the pavilion," Elinor said quietly, "and she has already arranged your betrothal to Lady Cordelia." Julian's face hardened. "She acts without my consent as always." "But you cannot ignore this forever, Julian. Your family's future, your responsibilities, they are far greater than anything between us. I understood that from the beginning. I simply allowed myself to forget it." "Elinor." "Please," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain steady. "Let me finish. Whatever this was, whatever it could have become, it was never truly possible. I think, deep down, we both always knew that." Julian said nothing, though the pain etched across his features spoke louder than words could have. Elinor turned and left the study before her resolve could crumble entirely, though the ache in her chest made it clear this was far from the end of the storm building around them. A letter waited on Elinor's small desk when she returned to her room that night, sealed with wax bearing no crest, slipped beneath her door by unknown hands. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, unsure why dread had already settled in her chest before she even read a single word. The message was brief and cold. It informed her that her younger brother, Thomas, had accumulated significant debts at a gaming house in London, debts that, if made public, would destroy what little reputation their family had left. The letter made no direct threat, yet its intention was unmistakable. Someone wanted her to understand exactly how much she stood to lose, and exactly how easily it could be taken from her. Elinor sat frozen, the paper shaking in her hands. She had not spoken to her brother in months, had not known the extent of his troubles, yet here was proof that someone had gone digging into her family's private affairs, someone with the resources and motivation to use that information as a weapon. She did not need to guess who had sent it. The following morning, she requested an audience with the Dowager Duchess, finding her once again in the same cold sitting room, seated with the same composed cruelty in her posture. "You wish to speak with me," Augusta said, not looking up from her needlework. "I received a letter last night," Elinor said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, "about my brother." "Did you?" Augusta's tone remained perfectly indifferent. "How unfortunate for your family." "You had him investigated." "I protect my family's interests, Miss Whitmore. Surely you understand that instinct, given how quickly you rushed to inform me of your own concerns just days ago." Elinor's hands clenched at her sides. "What do you want from me?" Augusta finally looked up, her eyes cold and unwavering. "I want you gone from this house before the betrothal ball, quietly, without scandal, without explanation to Julian or the children. In exchange, your brother's debts will find themselves mysteriously settled, and no further attention will be drawn to your family's affairs. Refuse, and I promise you, the consequences will extend far beyond your own reputation." The threat hung heavy in the air, deliberate and precise. Elinor understood immediately that this was no idle warning. The Dowager Duchess had the connections, the wealth, and the ruthlessness to follow through completely. "You would ruin an innocent young man, simply to remove a governess from your nephew's household." "I would do far more than that to protect this family's name," Augusta replied evenly. "You are a passing inconvenience, Miss Whitmore, nothing more. I suggest you remember your place before you cause damage that cannot be undone." Elinor left the room with her composure barely intact, her mind racing through impossible choices. She could not allow her brother to suffer for her own foolish, fleeting feelings. Yet the thought of leaving without explanation, of vanishing from the children's lives and from Julian's without a word, felt like tearing something vital out of her chest. She spent the following days in a haze of quiet anguish, continuing her lessons with Henry and Grace as though nothing had changed, though every smile she offered them concealed a growing storm beneath the surface. Julian noticed her distance immediately. "You have been avoiding me," he said one evening, finding her alone in the library, staring blankly at a book she had not turned a single page of in nearly an hour. "I have been busy," Alina said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. "Alina, please, something is wrong. I can see it in your face." She wanted desperately to tell him everything, the letter, the threat, the impossible choice weighing on her shoulders. But doing so would only draw him further into a conflict that could damage his standing, his family's reputation, and possibly even endanger her brother further if the dowager suspected Alina had broken her silence. "I am simply tired," she said instead, forcing a small smile. "The season brings its own exhaustion." Julian did not look convinced, but he did not press further, though the concern in his eyes lingered long after she excused herself for the evening. 2 days later, the household received formal word that the betrothal ball would take place at the end of the week, a grand affair intended to announce Julian's engagement to Lady Cordelia Ashworth before all of society. Preparations consumed the manor entirely. Flowers arrived by the cartload, musicians were engaged, and an army of seamstresses descended upon the house to fit gowns for every lady in attendance, including, to Alina's surprise, herself. "The dowager insists all household staff of note attend in proper dress," explained Alice, helping Alina into a modest yet elegant gown of deep blue. "She says it reflects well on the family to show a well-kept household." Alina suspected the true reason ran far deeper, though she said nothing, simply allowing herself to be fitted and prepared for an evening she dreaded more than any storm she had faced since arriving at Ashford Manor. The night before the ball, she finally made her decision. She could not remain in the household after such a public declaration of Julian's engagement, not without risking further exposure of her feelings, and certainly not while her silence protected her brother from ruin. She would attend the ball, as required, and then quietly submit her resignation the following morning, slipping away before anyone could question her true reasons for leaving. She wrote a brief letter of resignation late into the night, her hand trembling as she formed each careful word, citing personal family matters requiring her immediate attention. It was not entirely a lie, though it concealed far more truth than it revealed. Sleep did not come easily that night. Alina lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every stolen moment shared with Julian since her arrival, the storm at the lake, the quiet conversations in the library, the confession beneath the pavilion roof. She told herself these memories would have to be enough, that she had known from the very beginning such tenderness could never last, not for someone in her position. Yet as dawn approached and the household began stirring in preparation for the grand evening ahead, a quiet, stubborn part of her heart refused to fully accept the ending she had written for herself. The day of the ball arrived swiftly, filled with a flurry of preparation that left little room for private thought. Alina assisted with last-minute arrangements in the nursery, ensuring Henry and Grace were properly dressed and briefed on their expected appearance during the early portion of the evening before being sent to bed. "Why do you look so sad?" Grace asked, tugging gently at Alina's sleeve as she adjusted the girl's small satin bow. "Is it because of the ball?" Alina forced a gentle smile. "Balls can be tiring affairs, that's all." Grace studied her for a long moment with the same watchful eyes Alina had noticed the very first day they met. "You're not really tired. You're sad about something else, like when Uncle Julian gets quiet after thinking about Aunt Isabel." Alina knelt down, taking the girl's small hands in hers. "Whatever happens, Grace, I want you to know how much joy you and your brother have brought me these past months. That will never change." Grace's brow furrowed with quiet suspicion, though she said nothing further, simply wrapping her arms around Alina's neck in a brief, tight hug before being led away to the nursery for the evening. By the time Alina descended the grand staircase that evening, dressed in her deep blue gown, The manor had transformed entirely. Candlelight glowed from every corner, music drifted from the ballroom, and elegantly dressed guests filled the halls, their laughter and conversation blending into a bright, glittering hum of anticipation. She spotted Julian near the ballroom entrance, dressed formally in dark evening attire, greeting arriving guests with practiced composure that did not quite reach his eyes. Beside him stood Lady Cordelia Ashworth, elegant and poised, exactly the kind of bride society expected for a duke of his standing. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded hall, and for a fleeting moment, the noise and chaos of the ball seemed to fade entirely. Julian's expression flickered with something unspoken, longing, regret, perhaps even quiet desperation, before duty pulled his attention back toward his guests. Alina forced herself to look away, retreating toward the edges of the ballroom where household staff traditionally remained during such formal occasions. She told herself this distance was necessary, appropriate, the final step toward the ending she had already decided upon. Yet as the evening progressed, and the formal announcement of the betrothal drew steadily closer, Alina could not shake the growing sense that fate had not yet finished writing this particular chapter of their story. A firm hand closed around Alina's arm just as the orchestra paused between songs, pulling her sharply away from the edge of the ballroom before she could react. She turned to find the Dowager Duchess Augusta standing far too close, her painted smile a mask over something colder beneath. "Walk with me," Augusta said quietly, her grip tightening just enough to make refusal impossible without drawing attention. "Now." Alina allowed herself to be led into a quiet alcove just beyond the ballroom's edge, her heart pounding with sudden alarm. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" "Your resignation letter," Augusta said, producing the folded paper from within her own gown, "was discovered on your writing desk this afternoon by one of the maids, who quite sensibly brought it to me rather than leaving it for you to deliver quietly tomorrow morning." Alina's stomach dropped. That letter was private. "Nothing in this household remains private for long, Miss Whitmore, a lesson you would do well to remember." Augusta's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. "Since you have already decided to leave, I see no reason to delay the matter until morning. There exists a tradition in this family, one rarely observed in recent years, where departing staff of distinction perform a farewell dance before the assembled guests, a final courtesy before returning to whatever life awaits them beyond these walls." "I don't understand," Alina said, panic rising in her chest. "You will perform this farewell tonight," Augusta said, her voice leaving no room for argument, "immediately before the betrothal announcement. It will signal clearly to every guest present that your time in this household has ended, quietly, respectably, without further complication. Refuse, and I promise the details surrounding your brother's debts will find their way into far less forgiving hands before the week is through." Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "You would use this moment in front of everyone to humiliate me." "I would use this moment to protect my family," Augusta corrected sharply. "Whether you experience it as humiliation depends entirely on how gracefully you choose to accept it." Before Alina could formulate any response, Augusta had already turned, sweeping back toward the ballroom to make the necessary arrangements with the orchestra conductor. Alina stood frozen in the alcove, her mind spinning with the impossible cruelty of what was being demanded of her, a public performance marking her departure, staged deliberately to occur mere moments before Julian's engagement was announced to the very same crowd. She had wanted to leave quietly, privately, sparing everyone the discomfort of a scene. Instead, she was being forced into the most public possible farewell imaginable, orchestrated specifically to wound as deeply as possible while appearing, to any outside observer, as nothing more than a gracious tradition. There was no time to seek out Julian, no opportunity to explain or warn him of what was about to unfold. The orchestra conductor approached her directly, informing her quietly that she would perform a single formal dance, alone, before the assembled guests, following the customary steps reserved for such farewell occasions. Alina's hands trembled as she moved toward the center of the ballroom floor, the crowd parting slightly to make room, their curious murmurs rising as they realized something unplanned was occurring. She caught sight of Julian near the far end of the room, his brow furrowed with confusion as he noticed her standing alone at the center of the floor, dressed in her deep blue gown, clearly about to perform something entirely unexpected. The orchestra began to play, a slow, formal melody reserved for exactly this kind of solemn tradition. Alina closed her eyes for just a moment, gathering every ounce of composure she possessed, before beginning the careful, practiced steps of the farewell dance, moving alone across the polished floor while hundreds of eyes watched in fascinated silence. Each step felt like a small piece of her heart breaking away, though her posture remained perfectly controlled, her expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath the surface. She thought of Henry, chasing his kitten through the rain. She thought of Grace, sketching pictures of the lake and the willow trees. She thought of quiet evenings in the library, of a hand hovering near hers beneath a pavilion roof during a storm neither of them had wanted to end. Julian watched from across the room, his confusion slowly transforming into dawning horror as he realized exactly what was happening, and exactly what it meant. This was no ordinary tradition. This was a farewell, orchestrated publicly, and clearly against Alina's own wishes, given the barely concealed tension visible in every graceful, deliberate movement she made. He took a step forward, intending to stop the performance entirely, but his aunt's firm hand caught his arm, holding him back with surprising strength. "Let her finish," Augusta whispered sharply. "Causing a scene now will only draw more attention to something better left quietly concluded." Julian's jaw tightened with barely restrained fury, though he forced himself to remain still, watching helplessly as Alina continued the final measures of the dance, her movements growing slightly less steady as the music approached its conclusion. As the final notes of the melody faded into silence, Alina came to a stop at the center of the floor, facing the assembled crowd directly. She lowered herself into a deep, formal curtsy, the traditional final gesture marking the end of her service within the household. But as she rose from the curtsy, something in her carefully maintained composure finally broke. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears she had fought desperately to contain throughout the entire performance, lifted briefly to meet Julian's across the crowded room. In that single unguarded moment, every emotion she had tried so hard to conceal, the grief, the longing, the quiet devastation of a love she believed impossible, became fully, unmistakably visible. The ballroom fell into an uncomfortable hush, guests exchanging confused glances, sensing they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple farewell tradition, though few understood exactly what they had seen. Julian, however, understood completely. Something inside him shifted, decisively and irrevocably, the careful walls he had built around his own grief and duty crumbling entirely in the face of the raw honesty reflected in Alina's tear-filled eyes. He moved before he had even fully decided to do so, crossing the ballroom floor with quick, purposeful strides, ignoring the startled murmurs rippling through the crowd around him. Augusta's sharp voice called after him, a warning laced with barely concealed panic, but Julian did not stop, did not hesitate, did not allow years of careful restraint to hold him back any longer. He reached Alina just as she turned to retreat from the center of the floor, her composure finally beginning to crack entirely under the weight of everything she had carried silently for weeks. "Alina, wait," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom. She froze, unable to move, unable to breathe, as every guest in attendance turned to watch the unfolding scene with rapt, breathless attention. "You cannot leave like this," Julian continued, closing the remaining distance between them until he stood directly before her, seemingly indifferent to the hundreds of watching eyes surrounding them. not without knowing the truth. "Julian, please," Alina whispered, painfully aware of Lady Cordelia standing nearby, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and dawning realization. "This is not the place." "This is exactly the place," he said firmly, reaching for her trembling hands and holding them gently within his own. "I have spent months pretending my feelings for you were simply gratitude, simply friendship, simply appreciation for someone who cared for my niece and nephew with such devotion. But that was never the entire truth, and I refuse to let you walk out of this house believing otherwise." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading rapidly as the implications of his words settled fully into the minds of every guest present. Somewhere near the edge of the room, Augusta's face had gone pale with fury, though she remained frozen, seemingly unable to intervene without causing even greater scandal than what was already unfolding before the entire assembly. Alina searched Julian's face desperately, torn between overwhelming hope and the crushing weight of everything that still stood between them: the betrothal, the scandal, her brother's precarious situation, and the impossible gulf of status separating a duke from a governess. "Your engagement," she managed to whisper. "Lady Cordelia, your family's expectations." "None of that matters if it costs me you," Julian said quietly, though his voice carried enough conviction that everyone nearby could hear it clearly. "I have lost too much already, Alina. I refuse to lose this as well, not without at least fighting for it first." The ballroom remained utterly silent, every guest holding their breath as they watched a duke's carefully planned engagement announcement transform, in a matter of moments, into something entirely unexpected, something raw and honest and undeniably real, unfolding directly before their astonished eyes. Lady Cordelia stepped forward first, breaking the stunned silence that had settled over the ballroom, her composed expression revealing nothing of shock or embarrassment, but rather something closer to quiet relief. "Julian," she said calmly, drawing every eye toward her, "perhaps it would be wise to finish this conversation privately, before either of us says something that cannot be unsaid before so many witnesses." "You have every right to be angry," Julian said, turning toward her with genuine regret evident in his expression. "I never intended to embarrass you tonight, and I owe you a proper explanation, privately, immediately." Cordelia's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I suspected something of this nature long before tonight, Julian. I agreed to this arrangement because it suited my own family's interests, not because I harbored any illusions about deep affection between us. Attend to your explanations elsewhere. I will manage the guests." Her quiet grace in that moment silenced several nearby whispers, though the ballroom remained charged with tension as Augusta finally pushed forward, her fury barely contained beneath a thin veneer of forced composure. "Julian, you will end this display immediately," she hissed, low enough that only those closest could hear clearly. "You are humiliating this family in front of half the county." "I am done allowing this family's reputation to dictate every choice I make," Julian replied, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I have spent years grieving quietly, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of appearances. I will not sacrifice this as well." "You would throw away everything for a governess," Augusta snapped, though her voice cracked slightly, betraying genuine fear beneath her anger. "Do you understand what people will say, what this will cost you?" "I understand exactly what it will cost me to lose her," Julian said quietly, turning back toward Alina, who stood frozen beside him, still trying to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. "That cost I am no longer willing to pay." Alina's mind raced desperately through the tangled threat still hanging over her family. Even now, even with Julian's declaration ringing clearly across the stunned ballroom, the danger to her brother remained unresolved, a threat that could still destroy everything the moment Augusta chose to act upon it. "Julian," Alina said quietly, pulling him gently aside from the immediate crowd, her voice trembling with urgency. "There is something you need to know before this goes any further." He studied her worried expression carefully. "Tell me." "Your aunt has threatened my family," Alina admitted, the words spilling out in a rushed, anxious whisper. "My brother has accumulated significant debts, and she discovered them, using the information to pressure me into leaving quietly. That is the true reason behind my resignation, and behind tonight's forced performance." Julian's expression darkened immediately, his gaze snapping toward his aunt with renewed fury. "Is this true?" Augusta's silence, coupled with the flicker of guilt crossing her features, confirmed the accusation more clearly than any words could have. "You would destroy an innocent family simply to remove someone you deemed unsuitable," Julian said, his voice low and dangerously controlled. "After everything this family has already endured, you would inflict that same cruelty upon others without hesitation." "I did what was necessary to protect our name," Augusta said defensively, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Someone had to think of the family's future, since you seemed determined to ignore it entirely." "The family's future," Julian said firmly, "will not be built upon threats and cruelty. If you have caused harm to Alina's brother, you will personally see it undone, immediately and completely. I will not allow innocent people to suffer for decisions that were never theirs to make." The tension between them stretched taut, the surrounding guests watching in fascinated, uncomfortable silence, clearly aware they were witnessing far more than a simple broken engagement. Augusta's composure finally crumbled slightly, years of careful control giving way to something closer to genuine regret as she recognized the depth of damage her actions had caused. "I will resolve the matter with her brother's creditors by morning," Augusta said quietly, her voice noticeably subdued. "I did not intend for things to unfold quite this publicly." "Regardless of your intentions," Julian replied, "the outcome remains the same. I trust you understand this conversation is far from finished, though we will continue it privately, away from our guests." Augusta gave a stiff, reluctant nod before retreating from the immediate center of attention, leaving Julian and Alina standing together amid the lingering murmurs of the astonished crowd. Alina felt lightheaded with the sudden shift in circumstances, relief and disbelief tangled together as she struggled to fully comprehend the events unfolding around her. "Julian, are you certain about this? About all of this? Once this moment passes, there will be no taking it back. Every person in this room will speak of what happened here tonight." "I have never been more certain of anything," Julian said, his eyes steady and unwavering as he searched her face. "I spent so long believing duty required silencing my own heart, believing love and responsibility could never coexist within someone of my position. You taught me otherwise, Alina, through nothing more than your honesty and quiet strength." Alina's eyes filled with tears, though this time they carried none of the earlier grief, only overwhelming, cautious hope. "Julian, I have nothing to offer this family. No title, no fortune, nothing beyond myself." "That has always been more than enough," he said softly, lifting her hand gently to his lips. "I do not need a duchess who understands politics and society perfectly. I need someone who understands honesty, kindness, and genuine devotion, someone willing to run into a storm without hesitation when it truly matters. I have already found exactly that person." The remaining guests, sensing the private nature of the moment despite its very public setting, began quietly resuming their own conversations, allowing Julian and Alina a small measure of privacy amid the crowded ballroom. Cordelia, true to her earlier promise, guided the orchestra back into gentle music, smoothing over the evening's dramatic turn with practiced grace. In the days that followed, Ashford Manor buzzed with activity far different from the tense atmosphere of previous weeks. Augusta, true to her word, quietly settled Thomas Whitmore's debts, though her relationship with Alina remained understandably strained. softened only slowly through Julian's steady insistence on fairness and accountability within his own household. Henry and Grace received the news of Julian and Alina's engagement with unrestrained joy. Grace declaring immediately that she had known something wonderful was developing between them long before either adult had been willing to admit it themselves. "I told you everyone was sad here before," Grace said one afternoon, watching Alina and Julian walk together through the garden, hand in hand, near the very willow trees where Henry had once hidden with a frightened kitten. "But you're not sad anymore, Uncle Julian, not even a little." "No," Julian agreed, glancing toward Alina with quiet, unmistakable affection. "Not anymore." Word of the dramatic ballroom confrontation spread quickly throughout society, as Alina had feared it might, though the response proved far kinder than she had anticipated. Rather than scandal and ruin, many within their social circle found themselves quietly moved by the sincerity of Julian's public declaration, recognizing genuine devotion when they witnessed it so plainly displayed. Lady Cordelia, in a surprising turn, became something of an unexpected ally throughout the following months, offering practical guidance as Alina navigated the unfamiliar demands of her new position within society. Their friendship, born from an awkward and very public beginning, grew steadily into genuine mutual respect. Months later, Ashford Manor once again filled with music, laughter, and candlelight, though this time for an entirely different occasion. Alina stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed not in the modest gown of a governess, but in the elegant attire befitting the woman about to become Duchess of Ashford. Henry and Grace waited eagerly at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in their finest clothing, practically vibrating with excitement as they prepared to walk ahead of her toward the awaiting ceremony. Julian stood waiting near the garden pavilion, the very place where their fragile connection had first been openly acknowledged during a storm neither of them had anticipated. As Alina descended the staircase and made her way toward him, guided by the joyful presence of the children she had come to love as her own, she felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had once defined so much of her time within these walls. The ceremony itself remained relatively small and intimate, a deliberate choice reflecting both Julian and Alina's shared preference for genuine connection over grand spectacle. Augusta attended, her presence marking a slow, ongoing effort toward reconciliation, her stern composure softened just slightly by the evident happiness surrounding her nephew. As Julian and Alina exchanged their vows beneath the same pavilion roof that had once sheltered them from a violent storm, Alina found herself reflecting on the winding, uncertain path that had led her to this moment. She thought of the desperate rush through rain and darkness on her very first night at Ashford Manor, the quiet conversations shared in the library, the painful uncertainty of feeling something she believed could never be acknowledged, and finally, the public, unguarded curtsy that had changed the entire course of both their lives. She had arrived at Ashford Manor believing herself simply a governess, hired to manage two grieving children within a household clouded by loss and quiet sorrow. She left that chapter of her life behind as something far greater, proof that genuine kindness, unwavering honesty, and quiet strength could overcome even the most rigid boundaries society sought to enforce. As the ceremony concluded and applause rippled softly through the small gathering of family and friends, Julian leaned close, whispering words meant only for her. "You once told me sorrow does not disappear by ignoring it, that it only grows heavier the longer it is denied," he said softly. "I am grateful every single day that you were brave enough to teach me the same lesson applies equally to love." Alina smiled, her heart full in a way she had once believed impossible for someone in her position. "And I am equally grateful, Your Grace, that you were brave enough to beg me not to leave." Together, hand in hand, they turned to face the small crowd of loved ones gathered to witness the beginning of their new life together, the quiet strength of a simple governess having transformed, through honesty and unwavering courage, into the foundation of an entirely unexpected, deeply cherished love.